A disturbing smash and grab video goes viral out of Oakland, California. Could the shop owners have shot those intruders? We got some thoughts. This is attorney Andy Marcantel and attorney Rachel Moss. We are the attorneys at the Attorneys for Freedom Law Firm, here today to talk about a video that's been making the rounds that's pretty disturbing. How you doing today, Rachel?
I'm doing great. I've been seeing this video all over social media. People have a lot to say about it, so I'm really interested to just dive in and watch that video.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because most of the reaction, I think, has been guttural, is you could describe it as, because it really does invoke a reaction. When you see this, it's very disturbing. And so I'm really excited to kind of put it into a legal vacuum, if you will, today, and just do a nice, objective, cold, calculated legal analysis with you. So why don't we start by watching the video?
Definitely.
Awesome. All right, so at least one of them has a gun drawn. They have hammers, and they're smashing away. Six people inside. Getting jewelry. And she's calling her husband right now. And here he comes with a firearm. No shots fired, and they immediately retreat. Pretty disturbing video there. And they had mentioned that this was kind of, they've had break-ins before, they've had robberies before at this particular store. Apparently this family has been there for many generations. My understanding is this store opened in the 80s at some point, and her father worked there, and the family works there for many years, and so they've had break-ins before, but nothing quite to this level of, I guess, drama.
I did see that Diane, the shop owner, her father was actually shot and killed in this very same store. So they've had similar experiences, which I suspect is why they're armed at this store. But watching this video, it's definitely scary. And I think what you said earlier about it's really easy to just have an emotional response to this video, because you see a somewhat elderly woman alone in the shop with one other employee, pretty defenseless against six men screaming for help, and she has to wait for someone to come out of the back room in order to defend her.
Yeah, I mean, let's spend a moment and talk about that, because the fact that her father worked at this store and got shot and killed in the same building really made an impression upon me. Can you imagine that? Like, if your parent had died doing the same job in the same building as you, like, it seems like it'd be really traumatic.
Yeah, I was surprised as well, because I think my initial reaction is, really, you want to keep going with your store?
Yeah, why would you want to be in the same
after
building?
Something like that? But I was definitely impressed when I was researching this case on the internet, because Diane and her family really expressed this passion for the store, and they felt like their community needs something like this store. And I think that's a big reason why a lot of people on social media are relating to this story, because they see these people that are just kind of living what would normally be considered the American dream of owning a thriving business in a nice area, and it gets broken into. Their dreams are literally shattered by these individuals' hammers. And
these are really principled shop owners. They're like, we're not leaving. I mean, even in the aftermath of this, they've been on TV, and people have been sticking cameras in their faces after the video went viral. And their attitude is, we're not going to be dismayed by this. This was outrageous. It was inappropriate. It's crazy. We want something to be done about it. We want the law to be enforced more seriously in our neighborhood in Oakland. But we're not going to let them scare us away. We're not going to let them drive us out of town. And obviously, they have a long track record of doing that if there's been a fatality of a family member in the store before. So I was just, like, before even getting into the analysis, I was like blown away by how principled these people are to live through something like this and say, nope, we're not leaving.
Yeah, they're truly just dedicated, I think, to bettering their community, and they want their community to have access to something like their jewelry store. But I think what a lot of people are starting to wonder is it worth it in places like Oakland, California now to take this huge risk to provide something that normally would have been a great benefit to the community, but really be risking your lives, your family's lives, maybe even your customers' lives every single day by having a store like this?
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, too, I had heard that they didn't have insurance at the time. Not that they were negligent or forgot about it or something like that, but simply because there's so much crime in this area that to get a business insured, let alone a jewelry business or any business that sells valuables or keeps a lot of valuables in the store, is just unconscionable. The rates are just so high because of acts like this that occur every day in these types of neighborhoods.
Yeah, so because of that, I heard that this incident was fairly financially devastating for this family, and they actually are currently relying on a GoFundMe, I think, to get back at it. They're dedicated to keeping the store open, but they need a lot of support because of that lack of insurance.
Yeah, I checked the GoFundMe actually this morning before we filmed the video. I was just curious how it was doing because I saw in some of the news reports that they were doing pretty well. Mm-hmm. And when I checked it this morning, they had over $42,000 that they had raised so far of a $50,000 goal. So apparently, they're getting some help from the community, but not only in their immediate community, kind of everybody in the United States who has seen this maybe on national news, because I know it made the rounds on NBC and things like that, has seen this and are trying to, come together for them as a community. But it just made me think, Rachel, what if this hadn't been on video? What if that video camera was either off or grainy or pointed a different direction or something like this, which, of course, as we both know, happens all the time. In fact, the vast majority of crime is not captured cleanly on a video in a dramatic form like this. It just makes me think this would just be another crime statistic. These would just be another group of business people and entrepreneurs who'd just be out of luck. It's a sad thought. Yeah, it's a really sad thought. So let's get into the legal analysis. And I think that we should start with maybe a few baseline principles about self-defense. What do you think?
I agree.
All right. So what do you think is a relevant concept to kind of set as a baseline here?
So first, something good to keep in mind anytime you're talking self-defense is what exactly are you protecting? Are you protecting yourself? Are you protecting others? Are you protecting property? And there are different standards for each of those. So in this one video, I think we see some portions where you could argue they were defending themselves and other portions of the video where they would have been defending their property if they had taken action. I think there's slightly different analysis for those different aspects. So first, it's good to know that when defending property, deadly physical force is not justified. However, if you are defending yourself, if the other person seems to be exercising deadly physical force and you find it immediately necessary to protect yourself, that's an instance where you can then exercise deadly physical force.
Yeah, it's one of those bright line legal rules, which is you may never use deadly physical force merely to protect property. Now, there is an exception in Texas. Texas actually is the only state in the union that has kind of an interesting defense statute regarding defending property with deadly physical force. But outside of that, and certainly in California, you would definitely not be legally justified if all you were doing in exercising deadly physical force was defending property. And so kind of going through this video, the dynamic changes second to second, as it often does. Like whenever we're doing one of these cases, as you know, because we've done a whole bunch of them, we've done a bunch together as well. Oftentimes we're pondering over a video. Maybe it's a 30-second video that we ponder over for hours, where we go through frame by frame and we say, well, right now, if they had pulled the trigger right at this moment, would have been good. And then the next moment, now it's no good anymore. And this video is, of course, no exception. So when they first bust in, and my understanding to kind of how they get into the jewelry store, maybe the front door is locked and you have to gain entrance to it with permission by the shop owner. I think one person pretended, I think there was a total of 8 people involved in this heist, and one person pretended to be an interested customer. One person was sitting out as a getaway driver, essentially. Maybe there were 2 getaway drivers, not exactly clear. And then 6 people come in once the entrance is gained under those false pretenses. 6 people come in and start the smash and grab. What are your thoughts on their initial entrance and what kind of force would have been legally justified here?
In their initial entrance, you see them coming in with these giant hammers. And I could see from that woman's perspective that as these men were coming towards her, holding hammers in hand, it wasn't necessarily clear what they were going to be doing with them. I could see that could be an instance where that woman could reasonably believe that those individuals were about to exercise deadly physical force against her. I think the types of hammers they had would certainly qualify as a deadly weapon.
No doubt.
And so if she saw them coming at her, I think she could argue that she'd be justified in exercising deadly physical force against them. I could see other individuals taking a different position. Maybe a prosecutor, for example, maybe a judge or jury might take a different position. They might say, it's a jewelry store. It's pretty obvious what they're coming in for. But I think that woman could say that she had a reasonable belief that they were about to take some sort of deadly physical force
with just
against
the
her.
hammers. Yeah,
Just the
before we
hammers.
even get to the gun. Right, because the guy comes in, it's tough to tell from the video, but there's at least one person aggressively brandishing a gun and pointing it at the employees of the store. So now's a good time, now that we have people with hammers raised coming in, they're all masked, and we have somebody pointing a gun, also masked, coming in an aggressive manner. Now's a good time to pause and talk about what the standard for self-defense is. So before you can exercise deadly physical force, you need to be in imminent fear of serious physical injury or death. So let's break that down a little bit. Imminent means it's like right there. If you don't exercise deadly physical force, you are going to almost inevitably or very likely suffer serious physical injury or death. So to kind of start with the guy with the gun, if somebody's pointing a gun at you, that is almost guaranteed that you're going to be justified in shooting that person, even if it's a fake gun. And the reason for this, and we've talked about this in other similar cases, where all that matters is what's going on in the person's head, right? Do they reasonably believe that somebody's sticking a gun in their face? And we watched that video. It didn't look like a toy. Didn't have a little rubber tip on it. It wasn't multicolored or anything like that. It looked like a real gun. So a lot of people have been asking, what could she have done if at the moment that she popped up from behind the counter, she had just shot the guy? Would she have been justified? I would say absolutely defensible use of deadly physical force, at least pertaining to the guy who's waving the gun around pointing it.
I completely agree. I think it would be very hard for a prosecutor, officer, judge, jury to argue otherwise, that her belief would have been unreasonable in that situation. Because when you're facing a firearm is pointed directly at you, that's almost always imminent. You're almost always in that imminent risk. The way I always like to break down imminency to people is I always like to use the example if someone says, hey, I'm going to come kill you in 10 minutes. You know that's not imminent. You have 10 minutes to kind of get your act together. But
even if it's a credible threat, too,
even if it is a credible threat, correct. And I think sometimes that can feel a little hard to stomach when you're facing a credible threat. But that's just how serious these statutes are. However, anytime a gun is pointed directly at you, you know it takes less than a second for that person to pull a trigger. So it's a
muscle twitch and then you're dead, basically. It doesn't get more imminent than that.
Exactly.
Yeah, and even if the gun is negligently discharged, because you and I have had many cases, and we've represented victims and defendants who didn't set out to shoot somebody, but because of the heat of the moment and because the fact that you're moving around quickly, or maybe you see something that startles you and you maybe negligently or recklessly pull the trigger and somebody ends up dead, you got to keep those factors in mind too when you're analyzing what counts as imminency. So it sounds like we both agree, had she popped up from behind the counter in that moment with a firearm and discharged it and even killed the person with the gun, totally justified in terms of a use of deadly physical force.
Now, I want to hear what you think about the hammers.
That's the part I'm excited to talk about.
I took, I know maybe what some people would say, a fairly strong position, that I think them busting in with the hammers, having them raised, ready to strike, I think from the shop owner's perspective, it would be unclear whether they were planning on striking the counter or striking her. So I think it would be defensible in that case for her to argue that she was acting in self-defense, and she would have been able to use deadly physical force if she had had a weapon in that moment.
Yeah, to me, this is a much more interesting question. Like, where is it? We both agree, like, good shoot, green light, shoot the person who's pointing a gun at other human beings. The more interesting question is, can she then pivot and start shooting the people with the hammers one by one who are smashing into this? And I think the answer is much less clear and much more interesting to talk about, right? I could see, for example, somebody in her position reasonably believing that they were going to come in with the intention first of killing any witnesses and any people that might stop them from their crime spree, and then turning the hammers to the counter and start trying to get the valuables, right? That happens in a lot of these types of situations. It's let's kill the person first and then let's loot the house, loot the business, loot the car, whatever it is. Don't leave any witnesses, kill them, and then take the valuables. That's a reasonable belief. And so her defense attorney, had she turned, when they first came in with the hammers raised in an aggressive way, had she turned and started shooting them one by one, I think the defense attorney definitely has an argument that she had the reasonable belief that she was in imminent risk of serious physical injury or death from 6 masked assailants aggressively wielding hammers. But it gets more interesting even still when they clearly start bashing into the counter, because I think that this changes the analysis and the reasonableness of the analysis in terms of a prosecutor arguing, come on, it's obvious what they were doing is they were after the property. They weren't wielding the hammers to try to injure her, for example.
Yeah, I agree. Once they start actually smashing the case, you can kind of tell what they're after. And I think the woman and the man with her were even able to tell. They did probably the smart thing in that scenario and tried to retreat, get themselves away from danger and calling out the husband to come out with the firearm. However, I think there could still, the criminal defense attorney in me says, I feel like I could still find a way to defend that if she had chosen to exercise deadly physical force. I think in a fast-paced situation like that, especially with glass flying everywhere as it's happening, I think you never know when they're going to turn the hammer towards you.
Absolutely. And we've already seen that one of them is armed and okay with pointing the gun in people's faces. How do we know that some of the other assailants aren't similarly equipped to do the same and inclined to do the same? They can throw the hammers, they can hop that glass very easily and chase the person down, or they might be armed. So I agree with you. This is definitely a case that's defensible, even if she chooses to shoot them as they're bashing in the counters. But this goes to illustrate the point we were talking about earlier, Rachel, which is, think about that. That's a matter of like 2 seconds from the time that they're coming in with hammers overhead, coming at her in an aggressive way, which I think we both agree is, if she shoots him, way more defensible, to 2 seconds later, now they're focused on a counter, bashing it and not directly facing her anymore, the hammer assailants. All of a sudden, it becomes a more difficult case. Not an impossible case to defend, but a more difficult case, because we could imagine a California prosecutor saying, hey guys, she can't use deadly physical force in order to defend property, and it's very obvious that they were trying to get the property and they were no longer threatening her directly. So yeah, it's a really interesting thing that these cases can just turn on a matter of seconds, right?
I agree.
So let's talk about the husband who pops out and saves the day, who is a 76-year-old husband. I think she's 69, he's 76. The woman did not have a firearm immediately available to her. Looked like there was, I don't know if that was her son. I've seen her son in the media. I saw that there was another, looked like a young man or something in the background, also behind the counter. But neither of them had a firearm readily available there. They have to run around the corner. What are your thoughts about what happens next?
In terms of what happens next, we see the husband come out after the 2 individuals run into the back. So it sounds like they were calling for him the whole time. I couldn't hear exactly what they were saying over the video, but they appeared they were calling for the husband. He comes out, has the gun pointed. In Arizona, we have something called defensive display of a firearm. Here, pointing usually goes beyond defensive display. However, in this situation, I think, again, as long as these individuals have the weapons out, they have their deadly weapons out, they're using them in some way, I think he was justified in pointing the firearm at them. He didn't go beyond any force that was necessary. He didn't actually fire the firearm, because pretty much as soon as he came out, they started to run. It actually looks like they might have seen him before he was even visible on the security footage we watched, because it looked like they started to run away pretty quickly. Yeah. Once they were retreating, however, that's where you have to be careful. I think because they were clearly retreating, he would no longer have been justified if he had taken shots at that moment.
Yeah, we've had plenty of cases where the gunshot wound is in the back, right? And they're like we said earlier, very, very few of these types of incidents are actually caught on video, clearly showing the whole interaction and everything leading up to it and afterwards. But suppose that they're retreating and that he shoots them in the back. Well, now we got a problem potentially, because returning to that very important legal standard of, you have to be in imminent fear of serious physical injury or death. Your argument starts to become weaker that you are in that imminent fear of serious physical injury or death if they're in full retreat. And there's a different angle of this video that I've seen that maybe we can find and put on this video, where it shows them like scrambling over each other. Like basically as soon as they see the barrel of that gun come around that corner, they're crawling over each other, trying to, scrape their way out of there as soon as possible in full retreat mode. So would definitely be a much, much, much more difficult case had he fired into their backs or something like that while they were in full retreat. My question is this too. Why is this not all over the news in the most pro-gun spin possible? This guy's a hero. He came out, no doubt, and I know his son had commented to this point to the news, which is certainly true. He said if he hadn't come out and defended the property with that gun, they would have kept going. And while they managed to get away with like 85% of our valuables in the store, which is certainly, it'd be an understatement to say that's devastating to any business. Nothing would have stopped them from getting the full 100% and maybe even harming somebody. This guy's a hero. And so why this isn't all over the news, touting this guy thank goodness there was a competent adult who was armed with a gun who came out and scared away the bad guys.
That is so true. The media seems to love bad guys with a gun story, but they rarely highlight stories like this where we see a good guy with a gun. And it actually probably resolved in the way that was safest possible for all parties. No shots were fired. There were no injuries, as far as I'm aware, of anyone in the store or of any of the assailants. And it looked like here having a firearm allowed him to protect his family as well as his property. This should be a huge success. And yet the media still loves to point at all the failures that have happened.
Yeah, why is this not headline news? Man defends store and his family from assailants with a firearm. It should be all over the news. But Rachel, just from doing so many different cases in different jurisdictions, with our attorneys on retainer program, obviously we practice all over the United States through the process called Pro Hoc Vice, and we represent people who are involved in self-defense related incidents who get charged with crimes. And I think about the variety of different jurisdictions that we've had the fortune to be able to practice in this program. And for example, right now we have active cases in Texas, we have active cases in Georgia, we have active cases in Florida. And I think about how jurisdictions like those and states like those, and even like down to the local media coverage in places like those, covers these things differently. Like Mark and I recently did a video on that case in Houston, which was the guy who defended the crowd at the taco shop. He shot the guy who was doing an armed robbery at the taco shop. And the way local media in that particular jurisdiction ran it, much of them treated him like a hero because he is a hero. And they're broadcasting. There's really something that happens to your society depending upon which messages you choose to broadcast as part of your society and your culture. They're sending a message in that particular community. You don't get to go into stores and rob people at gunpoint, or else there's going to be consequences. It all comes down to what type of a society do we want to live in? What type of a community do we want to live in? This, on the other hand, the media is I'm not saying basically anything about it, essentially trying to sweep it under the rug what happened here. And the reason why this happened is because crime has gotten so horrible in this area without messages like this being broadcast that local business owners can't even afford to insure their businesses because nobody wants to do business there and nobody wants to insure a business there.
Exactly. And I want to live in a community where business owners can feel comfortable owning a business. They can feel comfortable having insurance for that business, and they can feel comfortable defending their business. And you're absolutely spot on when you say, depending on where you live, the media may not support that narrative. And that can, I think, be scary for a lot of Americans. And that also brings to mind that depending on what jurisdiction you're in, it makes a huge difference on how an officer, how a prosecutor is going to consider your case. It's very interesting to look at how in maybe California and Texas, the exact same thing could happen. And the result could be completely different for that individual that chose to defend themselves.
Yeah, this is such an important point. I feel like we beat this horse to death every single time we talk about this because, as attorneys, we get asked all the time, well, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to shoot in this type of a situation? What if they do this and I do this? And we can speculate for sure. We can read you statutes and tell you the black letter of the law like we have today. But at the end of the day, because of the way the jury system is constructed, all you're really asking us to do when you ask us, can I do this? Can I do that? You're asking us to predict what a hypothetical jury of randomly selected people from that particular jurisdiction are going to think is reasonable. That's all it is. At the end of the day, you're asking us to predict a local jury's reasonableness preferences, right? And so that changes depending upon the jurisdiction you're in. And just like you just correctly pointed out, whether a prosecutor is going to take up the case and what type of charges they're going to seek and whether they bring it to a grand jury and everything like that also varies tremendously by jurisdiction because different people in different parts of the country think about these issues differently. So I think something that has really strengthened me as an attorney is practicing in so many different jurisdictions and learning the difference between those jurisdictions and what to expect out of local juries, local prosecutors, and even local law enforcement, as you pointed out. Most attorneys will spend their entire career practicing kind of in a bubble of sorts, where it's like, I'm in this jurisdiction in this state, and that's understandable because the American Bar Association says we got to be licensed in a particular state. But when you start practicing across the country through this pro hoc vice, you just learn so much about how the same fact pattern in this jurisdiction could be a huge crime here, and the prosecutor says, I'm going to pass over here. So it's really interesting.
I agree. One other thing I wanted to ask you about when considering this video is in Arizona, we have a crime prevention statute on the books. How do you think, if it does it change your analysis at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And by a crime prevention statute, you're talking about something that basically says, hey, there are certain very serious crimes that we're going to kind of carve out and specify and say, yes, normally you need self-defense or a defense of a third party, and there needs to be imminent fear, reasonable fear of imminent serious physical injury or death, all the principles we were talking about today. But a lot of jurisdictions have something else that a lot of times we lawyers call crime prevention statutes. And what that says is if one of the very serious crimes specified by the legislature is being committed in your presence, and you can use deadly physical force in that moment in order to stop the perpetuation of that crime, then you can use the deadly physical force. So usually the types of things we're talking about are armed robbery, sexual assault, rape, things like that, obviously murder, homicide, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. So in other words, there are certain statutes out throughout the United States that say you can shoot and even kill somebody, and it has nothing to do whatsoever with self-defense or defense of a third party. In other words, has nothing to do whatsoever about being in imminent fear for your life. And so it's an interesting thing. So in a jurisdiction that had such a crime prevention statute, there are a number of those serious crimes going on here in this video. Definitely an dangerous armed robbery in progress. And so if there was a similar statute in California, then I think there would at least be some more ammunition, you could say, for a criminal defense attorney to defend that person.
Yeah, and that's what I was kind of thinking about that. I recently actually appeared on the news to talk about a burglary, and I specifically talked about Arizona's crime prevention statute. And I think something important that our statute captures is that you don't necessarily have to wait for the crime to be completed. If you see it in progress, you can take action. So I think it's great that certain areas have these statutes on the books because it really gives property owners, business owners, like you said, extra ammunition in order to defend themselves in these situations.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you said that too, because this is a really important concept that a lot of people don't understand when it comes to how much force do I have to wait for the bad guy to use before I can use my deadly physical force. Well, it follows the same principles as any self-defense, armed or not. Like, for example, if somebody's coming at you with fists raised, clearly angrily approaching you to attack you, the law does not require you to wait until their fist actually comes into contact with your face before you can exercise self-defense. So it's the same type of thing. This is why that imminency conversation that we were having earlier regarding how up in your face, essentially, is the potential harm or threat. How close to being committed and how readily can it be committed is so important in our legal analysis of self-defense. So I'm glad you brought that up. Anything else? Any other thoughts that you have about this particular video?
I think overall it just really brings to mind how risky it is to be a business owner in certain areas of the country right now. And it's why I really think that having things like crime prevention statutes on the books and strong self-defense laws are very important. I think it only helps Americans thrive if they feel comfortable in being able to protect their businesses and be able to exercise their right to self-defense or defending their property. I am concerned that something like this could, potentially scare Californians, make them more scared to open businesses. And having small businesses usually is something that only helps a community. So I do have that fear there, but luckily this is an example where we see the business owners be able to successfully defend their property without any danger happening. So maybe this story will actually serve to inspire people.
Or maybe it'll get swept under the rug. Mark and I have done a few in recent times of California gun owners defending themselves, their family, their property. And it's been really interesting whenever we do one of these legal analyses in a jurisdiction like California, because we're doing the research, and while the story is getting traction in different jurisdictions, as far as local coverage, it's getting swept under the rug and isn't really, nothing's happening from it. And of course, exactly what you're talking about, which is business owners don't want to open up their businesses and stake their livelihood on neighborhoods like this one in Oakland, are leaving California in droves. You and I live in Arizona, and we all know that a lot of Californians are fleeing California. I don't think that's an overstatement. They are fleeing California because of policies that allow for this type of behavior. But just kind of culturally, can you imagine if stories like this and stories like other recent videos that we've done in California where competent gun owners defend their property, their family, everything like that? Can you imagine if the local news over there promoted this type of stuff? Local hero pulls out, shop owner pulls out gun and scares away the bad guys. Here they are fleeing like cowards. And even if there was a shooting, putting that up and saying, yeah, this person defended themselves and actively and within the law defended their family and their property, it would send a certain type of message if that was the general attitude towards firearms and self-defense in these types of jurisdictions.
Yeah, I almost have to wonder, would news stories being promoted like that be the reason that maybe the next bad guy with a gun would hesitate to go and rob a jewelry store? If they saw these stories in the media, if they saw people successfully defending themselves, maybe they in turn would be less likely to commit these crimes.
Well, let's do our part and keep yakking about them whenever they come up, and we'll keep blasting them out on the channel. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Go and check out attorneysonretainer.us to learn all about our self-defense coverage program and what it can do for you. If you'd like to learn more about our law firm, go to attorneysforfreedom.com. Learn about our firm, learn about our attorneys, our awesome attorneys like Rachel Moss here and the whole gang, to learn who's going to be representing you in the case that, heaven forbid, you have to defend yourself or use a firearm at any time. You'll learn all about our philosophy on the website and what we do. Also, if you like this video, make sure to share it with a friend, throw a like on the video, leave us a comment down below if you have a question about the video or we missed something. And until next time, this has been Attorney Andy Marcantel and Attorney Rachel Moss. Peace.